In the morning, Ruth Cole carried a chair to look at the pictures of her late brother on the wall, something she did every day. Ted joined her and shared more stories about him. Later, Ruth went to her mother, who was sitting quietly in the fields, lost in thought. Seeing that her mother wasn't paying attention, Ruth went off to play by herself. As evening came and the air grew cold, Ted brought her a sweater and wrapped it around her so she wouldn't feel lonely. He mentioned his idea of building a pool near the fields for Ruth to use when she grew older, but Marion said it wasn't needed. Later, Ted sat beside her and showed a picture of Eddie, Minty's son, who taught English at a boys' school in Exeter. Ted told Marion he planned to hire Eddie for a sew job, and also wanted to work on his own writing. He asked Marion if there was anything he could do for her, knowing they were preparing to live apart. At Minty's house, Eddie often followed Ted, eager to learn from him. His father encouraged him to become a writer, seeing Ted as a good mentor. That night, Ruth had a dream and went to wake Ted. She told him she dreamed of a strange sound, like someone trying not to make a sound. Ted, being a writer, found her words inspiring. He carried Ruth back to her bed and told her a story about her late brothers, Tim and Tom, as he always did at bedtime. When Ruth noticed her mother wasn't in their room, she asked Ted where she was. He told her that Marion was staying in another house, as they had started taking turns living there. Ted then began writing a story based on Ruth's dream. Meanwhile, Marion went to meet Eddie, though she often told Ted she didn't want to hear from him anymore. She was still lost in her own thoughts and memories. When Marion saw the ship arrive, she went closer and called out Eddie's name, since she had never met him before. After greeting him, she asked him to drive, thinking a young man like him would enjoy it. Eddie told Marion he had expected Ted to pick him up, but she explained that Ted had lost his driving license a few months earlier. When Eddie finally met Ted, he expressed how much he admired his novels, especially The Door on the Floor, which was his favorite. Eddie asked if there was any work for him, and Ted said he needed squid ink for his new book and illustrations. He told Eddie to buy it from a fishmonger in Montauk the next day. Ted also shared that he and Marion were taking a break from each other and that he had rented a house in town. He asked Eddie to work there during the day but stay at the main house at night. Ted then showed him his room and told him to make himself comfortable. While Eddie looked at the family photos on the wall, Ruth suddenly screamed and ran off, thinking he was a stranger. Eddie noticed one of the people in the pictures looked a lot like him. Later at dinner, Alice, Ruth's babysitter, greeted Eddie before taking Ruth away. That evening, Eddie went to Montauk to get the squid ink for Ted. When he brought it back, he asked if Ted needed anything else. Ted told him to freeze the ink and then went to his art room to start working on a new drawing. Early in the morning, Eddie drove to the townhouse as Ted had told him. He arrived too soon and took a short nap in his car while waiting. When Marion came out, she greeted him briefly before leaving. After she was gone, Eddie went inside and used his free time to practice writing, one of the reasons he had come to work with Ted. Over the next few days, Eddie began watching Marion more often, as he had grown fond of her. One afternoon, a neighbor told him to speak with her. When they met, Marion was surprised to learn that Ted hardly checked on Eddie's meals or well-being. Feeling sorry for him, she offered to take him out for a proper dinner sometime. Eddie was thrilled. It felt like a dream to him. One day, while waiting for Ted, Eddie looked inside Mrs. Vaughn's car out of curiosity. She arrived soon after with Ted, but Ted quickly explained she was there to talk about her drawings, not wanting Eddie to get the wrong idea. He told Eddie he had left some notes for revision on the table. Later, as Marion took a quiet walk by the lake, Eddie secretly followed her from a distance. Afterwards, he drove Ted to Mrs. Vaughn's house. Since Ted planned to stay there for a while, he told Eddie to go back to the townhouse and work on the revisions. Marion had left an outfit on Ted's bed, the one she knew he liked, to surprise him. That evening, she kept her promise and took Eddie out for dinner. During the meal, Eddie mentioned that Ted wasn't much of a teacher, and Marion laughed, saying Ted only needed a driver after losing his license. She teased Eddie for being too serious for his age. Eddie tried telling her a joke. It wasn't very funny, but she smiled anyway. Marion then asked why he seemed interested in her, instead of Alice, Ruth's babysitter, who was closer to his age. Eddie simply said Alice wasn't his type. Marion replied that Alice was a kind and reliable nanny. As their talk went on, Marion began to open up. She admitted she sometimes felt it was a mistake for her and Ted to have another child. She explained that they had moved there hoping for a fresh start after losing their sons, Tim and Tom, but Ruth's arrival had changed everything. Though Ted was a caring father, he often didn't know what to do, and Marion herself didn't feel ready to be a mother again. Despite the heavy conversation, Marion enjoyed Eddie's company. Later that evening, they looked through old photos of Tim and Tom together. She thought about telling Eddie the full story, but decided to keep it to herself for the time being. Soon after, she went to her room to rest. The next day, Marion stayed at the townhouse. She knew Eddie liked her, and since she often felt lonely, she spent more time there. Soon, they grew close, and Marion began to feel a little less burdened by her past. Ted noticed the growing connection between them, but he didn't seem upset. In fact, he was glad to see Marion smiling again. One evening, he gave a reading of Eddie's favorite book, The Door on the Floor. The event was lively, and everyone enjoyed it, Eddie included. On the way home, Ted thanked Eddie for being kind to Marion and helping her find some happiness again. Later, Ted went to visit Marion's favorite spot by bicycle, but she wasn't there. He realized she was spending most of her time with Eddie. Though he tried to hide it, he began to feel uneasy, knowing he might be losing her after everything they had been through together. One night, Ruth sensed something strange in the house. Feeling uneasy, she went to her mother's room and saw something that frightened her. Marion comforted her and sent her back to bed, trying to calm her down. The next day, while Eddie was driving Ted to Mrs. Vaughn's house, Ted brought up Marion's recent behavior. He blamed Eddie for distracting her and said it was the reason she was drifting away as a mother to Ruth. His words showed a hint of jealousy, even though he himself was still involved with other women. After dropping Ted off, Eddie went back to see Marion, and they spent some quiet time together talking. During their conversation, Marion explained why she had never left Ted, even though he often spent time with the models he painted. She said Ted was the only one who truly understood her and what they had gone through, and that she had never been unfaithful to him until she met Eddie. While Ted worked on his sketches and Alice looked after Ruth, Eddie and Marion continued seeing each other. One evening, Eddie asked Marion about the accident that had taken the lives of her sons, Tim and Tom. The question left her silent and distant, and Eddie realized it wasn't the right moment to continue. Later that night, Ruth came to the living room while Marion was lost in thought. She told Eddie a story about a picture of her mother that seemed to show extra feet in it, saying it belonged to her and asking to keep it in her room. Eddie gently gave her the photo and carried her back to bed. Afterward, he covered Marion with a blanket as she slept on the couch, and then went to bed himself. The next morning, Ruth's scream filled the house. Eddie ran to her room and found her with a small cut on her finger caused by the broken glass from the photo frame. She was quickly taken to the hospital for treatment. While playing tennis, Ted blamed Marion for Ruth's recent accident. He said she had been a wonderful mother to their sons but distant toward Ruth, and he couldn't understand why. Eddie tried to defend her, saying it wasn't Marion's fault. He admitted he had asked her about the past, which had deeply upset her. That night, Ruth had a nightmare and refused to sleep. No matter how Ted tried, she only wanted her mother. Eddie went to fetch Marion, who was able to calm Ruth and help her rest. Afterwards, Eddie drove Ted back to the townhouse. Ted spent the night alone, lost in thought, unsure of what to do next, while Marion quietly cried over her growing guilt and confusion. Later, while spending time at the beach, Marion told Eddie she was ready to leave Ted, saying she had stayed with him longer than she should have. After their picnic, Eddie drove Marion and Ruth home. The next morning, Ted asked Eddie to deliver some of Mrs. Vaughn's sketches. When Eddie arrived, Mrs. Vaughn was expecting Ted instead. She tried to get close to Eddie, but he managed to leave before things went too far. Back at the house, he told Ted what had happened and mentioned that Mrs. Vaughn had expected to spend the whole Friday with him. Ted said he would come to pick Eddie up in about 45 minutes. When Eddie told Marion about this, she asked him not to return to Mrs. Vaughn's to pick Ted up. She explained that the delay would give her enough time to pack her things and leave before Ted came back. On Friday, Eddie drove Ted to Mrs. Vaughn's house while Ted shared a few writing ideas with him on the way. When they arrived, it was clear that Mrs. Vaughn was preparing for a gathering, and the sketches Ted had sent her were scattered all over the place. Ted asked Eddie to wait for about 10 minutes, saying he knew Mrs. Vaughn could be unpredictable. But remembering Marion's instructions, Eddie quietly left instead of waiting. Marion had carefully planned her departure and needed Eddie's help to make sure Ted wouldn't notice. She told him exactly what to do, and because Eddie cared for her deeply, he agreed to help. Afterward, he took Ruth to the hospital to have her stitches removed. Meanwhile, at Mrs. Vaughn's, things turned tense. She argued with Ted about his sketches and felt insulted when he told her he didn't want to continue spending Fridays with her. In anger, she tried to confront him but was stopped by one of her workers, who helped Ted get away safely. Furious, she fired the worker on the spot. Without a car, Ted went to his friend Mendelsohn's place for help. In return, he signed copies of his new books. At the same time, Eddie took Ruth to a frame shop to collect her photograph. There, Eddie spoke harshly to the staff, and the manager asked him to explain his complaint directly. The manager handed Eddie some papers to fill out, just as Marion had instructed. But as she read what he had written, she grew confused. It was far more personal and detailed than she had anticipated. Curious, she asked him what he really needed. Eddie explained that he only wanted a copy of a photograph for Ruth, since it was her favorite, and he knew Marion planned to take the rest of the pictures home. The manager, touched by his honesty and care, gave him the photograph for free, along with his notes. She also mentioned that she might have a summer job for him if he was interested. Feeling relieved, Eddie then took Ruth out for sandwiches, enjoying the small, simple outing they had planned. Meanwhile, Ted had managed to find a way back home sooner than expected. Marion had not anticipated his return. When their eyes met, Ted immediately understood that she was serious about leaving. There was nothing left to say. He simply watched, quietly and helplessly, as she got into her car and drove away, leaving a heavy silence behind. When Eddie returned home with Ruth, he immediately sensed that his time working for Ted was over. Ted confronted him and, during their conversation, revealed the complicated situation he had with Marion, sharing more than Eddie had expected. Soon after, Ted let Eddie go. Since Eddie had to catch a ferry the next day, he decided to stay the night. That evening, Ted came to Eddie's room and calmly shared the full story of the accident that had taken the lives of their sons. He explained how deeply it had affected both him and Marion, and that Marion had left Ruth behind because she feared she might fail as a mother, still weighed down by the lingering trauma. Eddie listened quietly, understanding for the first time the full depth of their loss and the reasons behind their actions. As the story drew to a close, Ted made arrangements to ensure Ruth would be cared for, hiring Mrs. Vaughn's former gardener to help with the house and the child. While the gardener drove Eddie to the ferry the next morning, Ted offered one final piece of advice, in writing. The smallest details are always important. The list of Sam planned all three of them. After Eddie left, Ted retreated to his private space under the tennis court door, leaving the house quiet, empty, and still.
Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and stay connected with us.